It always begins with a single drop of blood, a tiny crimson bead forming on the tip of a finger. In the sterile, whitewashed corridors of Silicon Valley, this organic fluid was not just biological matter. It was the new oil. It was the liquid currency of a $9 billion empire built on a foundation of pure glass. The year was 2014, and the world was under a spell. Everyone from veteran statesmen to hardened tech investors believed they were witnessing a miracle. They looked at a small, sleek black box called the Edison and saw the future of human health. The promise was intoxicatingly simple. No more long needles, no more vials drawn from bruised veins, no more waiting days for terrifying results. Just a prick, a nanotainer the size of a pill, and a machine that could run 200 diagnostic tests in minutes. It was supposed to be the iPod of healthcare, a device that would sit in every home, in every pharmacy, democratizing medicine for the masses. The valuation soared to the stratosphere. The magazines printed the face of the founder on their covers, hailing a new genius who had paused her education to save the world. But inside the locked laboratories of Palo Alto, the air was cold and heavy with secrets. The lights were always dim, casting long shadows over the rows of expensive equipment. While the world outside celebrated a revolution, the engineers inside were living in a silent horror movie. The Edison was not a miracle. It was a lie wrapped in glossy plastic. When the investors left the building, the reality of the machine revealed itself. It was an erratic beast. It could not handle the blood. The robotic arms jammed. The centrifuges spun so violently they shattered their own internal components, spraying blood and glass shards across the interior of the device. There was no magic in the box. There was only panic. To make the impossible promises work, the team had to cheat physics. They diluted the blood samples, stretching that single drop until it was useless water. They secretly ran the tests on standard commercial analyzers bought from competitors, hacking them to hide their origins. They were not inventing the future. They were staging an elaborate magic trick where the audience was risking their lives. The data on the screens was a fabrication. The error messages were suppressed. The revolution was a hollow shell held together by glue, tape, and a terrifying culture of absolute silence. This is not a story about a startup stumbling on its way to greatness. This is a crime scene where the weapon was a promise that could never be kept. The architecture of the lie began in the hallowed halls of Stanford University, the breeding ground for Silicon Valley royalty. But the 19-year-old chemical engineering student named Elizabeth Holmes did not want a degree. She wanted a legacy. She wanted to be a billionaire, not in the distant future, but now. She dropped out, taking her tuition money to fund a vision that existed only in her mind. This was not just ambition, it was the meticulous construction of a character, a deliberate crafting of a persona designed to dominate a room full of powerful older men. The transformation was calculated layer by layer until the human being disappeared behind the symbol. She adopted the uniform of the genius. The black turtleneck became her armor, a deliberate homage to Steve Jobs, worn every single day to signal an unwavering monk-like focus on work. It was a costume that screamed visionary before she had even invented a single working prototype. But the visual branding was just the surface. The true manipulation lay in the behavior. She trained herself to lower her natural vocal pitch, forcing her voice down into a deep baritone register that commanded authority. It was a voice that sounded synthetic, almost mechanical, designed to erase any trace of youthful femininity or uncertainty. Accompanying the voice was the stare. Employees and investors alike reported the same unsettling phenomenon. She rarely blinked. Her wide, unblinking blue eyes would lock onto a target, creating an intense, hypnotic vacuum that swallowed doubt. This was the reality distortion field in full effect. In the presence of Elizabeth Holmes, logic was suspended. When she spoke of a world without needles, she wasn't just pitching a product, she was selling a religious experience. She tapped into a primal human fear, the fear of pain, the fear of disease, the fear of the unknown inside our own bodies, and offered a technological salvation. The origin of this drive was not purely altruistic. It was a hunger for control, a psychological need to bend biology to her will. She surrounded herself with a board of directors made up of former relentless political titans, George Shultz, Henry Kissinger. These were men who had negotiated nuclear treaties, yet they were disarmed by a young woman who reminded them of their granddaughters. They fell for the image she projected. They saw the next Apple, the next Intel. They did not see the tyrant who fired anyone who said it cannot be done. In these early years, the company operated in stealth mode, a standard practice in the Valley, but Holmes took it to a pathological extreme. Secrecy became the culture. She demanded total loyalty and almost cult-like devotion from her staff. The outside world was the enemy. Even the laws of physics were treated as mere suggestions that could be overcome with enough capital and force of will. She isolated the engineering teams, preventing them from talking to each other, creating silos where no one knew the full picture. Only she stood at the top, the conductor of a silent orchestra, weaving a tapestry of half-truths. The black turtleneck was not just a piece of clothing, it was a shroud. Behind the deep voice and the unblinking eyes, the decision had already been made. The story was more important than the science.
In the shadowy recesses of the engineering department, the Edison device was stripped of its sleek plastic casing, revealing the chaotic truth hidden beneath the shell. To the outside world, this was a masterpiece of miniaturization, a lab on a chip. But to the exhausted engineers working 18-hour shifts, the machine was a thermodynamic nightmare. The internal components were packed so tightly that the heat from the motors cooked the blood samples before they could be analyzed. The robotic arm, tasked with moving the tiny pipette, was erratic and imprecise. It would frequently jam, or worse, the pipette tips would snap off, falling into the gears like a wrench thrown into an engine. The central problem was not software, it was physics. The nanotainer collected only a few drops of blood. This volume was simply insufficient for the chemistry required to detect pathogens or protein levels. When the engineers tried to run the tests, the signals were weak, drowned out by noise. The results were not just inaccurate, they were random number generation. To solve this, the team did not invent a better sensor. They invented a cheat. They began diluting the blood samples with saline solution, increasing the volume so the machines could read it. But this dilution altered the concentration of the analytes, rendering the data scientific gibberish. They were multiplying 0 by 0 and hoping for a 1. Faced with a non-functional prototype and a looming launch deadline with Walgreens, the company executed its most brazen maneuver, the hybrid hack. They secretly purchased commercial blood analyzers from Siemens, massive, reliable machines used by legitimate labs. These machines were too large to fit inside the Edison, so the team hacked the Siemens devices, stripping them down and hiding them in a secure room that visitors were never allowed to see. When a patient gave a blood sample, the Edison would make mechanical whirring noises, flashing lights to simulate processing. In reality, a technician would retrieve the sample, run it down the hall, dilute it, and feed it into the hacked Siemens machine. The deception went even deeper into the digital realm. The user interface on the Edison screen was a work of fiction. During demonstrations for investors or potential partners, the machine was often running a null protocol. The progress bar moving across the screen was not tracking a chemical reaction. It was a pre-recorded animation, an MP4 file playing on a loop. If the machine encountered an error, which happened constantly, the software was programmed to suppress the warning code. Instead of displaying error, it would simply display a falsified result or a request to try again. The entire system was a digital Trojan horse, beautiful on the outside, but filled with desperate technicians and stolen technology on the inside.
The clock struck 0. The time for theoretical testing was over. Elizabeth Holmes made the decision to push the Edison out of the laboratory and into the real world. The partnership with Walgreens was the trigger. In the sun-drenched suburbs of Arizona, Theranos wellness centers began to open their doors. To the unsuspecting customers, these centers looked like portals to a healthier life. The branding was soft, calming, and professional. But behind the drywall partitions, a game of Russian roulette was being played with public health. The company was no longer just faking data for investors. They were now issuing medical reports to real patients based on a technology that did not work. Inside the company headquarters, the atmosphere shifted from a startup to a totalitarian state. Sunny Balwani, the president and Holmes's enforcer, patrolled the glass corridors like a prison warden. He monitored employee keycard swipes, tracked internet usage, and fostered an environment of absolute paranoia. The open plan office, designed for collaboration, became a panopticon where no conversation was private. Engineers who raised safety concerns were not just ignored, they were targeted. They were pulled into glass-walled conference rooms and interrogated by aggressive lawyers. The non-disclosure agreement, NDA, was weaponized. It was no longer a standard corporate contract, it was a shackle. Employees were told that if they spoke a word of the truth to anyone, even their spouses, they would be sued into bankruptcy. The execution of the fraud required a logistical miracle to hide the failure. When patients in Arizona gave their blood, the samples were often not tested on site. They were secretly shipped on commercial flights back to California, preserving the illusion that the local Edison machines were doing the work. In the lab, the pressure was suffocating. Technicians were forced to falsify quality control checks. If a machine failed a calibration test, they were ordered to ignore it and run the patient samples anyway. The data that emerged was terrifying. Healthy people were told they were on the verge of a stroke. Cancer patients were told they were in remission when they were not. Pregnant women were given false flags about their unborn children. The wall of silence was built high and thick. The board of directors was kept in the dark, fed only curated reports and dazzling projections. The investors were kept at arm's length, banned from entering the lab. The employees were trapped inside, watching the disaster unfold, but too terrified to speak. Elizabeth Holmes had successfully created a hermetically sealed reality. Within the walls of Theranos, the lie was the truth. But outside, in the real world, the variables were impossible to control forever. Every false result sent to a patient was a crack in the dam. The execution of the plan was flawless in its audacity, but it was brittle. The company was now operating on borrowed time, and the debt was accruing not in dollars, but in potential human casualties.
The fortress of lies was built to withstand skepticism, lawsuits, and regulatory audits, but it had a microscopic crack that no amount of money could seal. The fatal flaw was not a line of bad code or a faulty circuit board. It was hubris. It was the supreme arrogance of believing that the laws of physics could be bullied into submission and that every human being could be bought or broken. Elizabeth Holmes believed she was the protagonist of reality, and everyone else was an NPC, non-player character, in her simulation. She underestimated the one variable that always crashes a closed system: conscience. The anomaly began with Tyler Schultz. He was not a corporate spy or a disgruntled ex-employee. He was the grandson of George Schultz, a board member and former Secretary of State. He was royalty within the company. Holmes thought his lineage made him safe, a compliant mascot. That was her mistake. Tyler was an idealist. He sat in the lab and looked at the raw data. He saw the assay validations failing day after day. He saw the quality control results being deleted, literally dragged into the trash bin on the computer desktop, so the numbers would look perfect. He realized the Edison was a random number generator that was about to diagnose real patients. When Tyler tried to speak up, the system attacked him. The company lawyers, led by the terrifying David Boies, ambushed him. They threatened to destroy his family's legacy, to sue him for millions, to crush his future. But they pushed too hard. Instead of breaking, Tyler went dark. He bought a burner phone. He contacted the one man who was immune to the Silicon Valley reality distortion field, John Carreyrou, an investigative reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Carreyrou was a creature of the old world. He didn't care about turtlenecks or vision statements. He cared about the math. The second fatal flaw was the single drop itself. It was a biological impossibility that they refused to accept. Blood drawn from a finger prick is not the same as blood from a vein. It is laced with tissue fluid and broken cells. It is dirty data. You cannot run precise quantitative tests on it, certainly not 200 of them. By clinging to the specific marketing hook, one drop, Theranos had handcuffed itself to a physics problem that had no solution. On October 15, 2015, the fatal flaw went public. Carreyrou published his article. It wasn't a hit piece, it was an autopsy of the fraud. The article revealed that the emperor had no clothes, and the magic machine was a myth. The single mistake was assuming that the world would stay asleep forever. The moment the article hit the stands, the $9 billion valuation began to evaporate like mist. The investors panicked. The regulators woke up. The fatal flaw was simple. You can fake a demo, you can fake a financial report, but you cannot fake a blood test when a patient's life is on the line. The truth, like a drop of blood in clear water, finally began to spread.
The glass castle at 1701 Page Mill Road stands silent now. The sleek, futuristic headquarters that once housed the ambition of a generation is now a ghost ship. The logo, a stylized blue drop that once promised salvation, has been scraped off the glass doors, leaving only a faint, dusty outline where the adhesive used to be. Inside, the Edison machines, those black boxes once guarded like nuclear secrets, were not placed in museums. They were hauled away to recycling plants, crushed into unrecognizable cubes of jagged plastic and metal. The fall was absolute. In the span of a few months, the valuation of Theranos went from $9 billion to zero. It was the fastest, most violent destruction of wealth in corporate history. But the true aftermath did not play out in the empty laboratories. It played out in a federal courtroom in San Jose. The public witnessed the final transformation of Elizabeth Holmes. The Steve Jobs of biotechnology shed her skin one last time. The iconic black turtleneck, the messy unkempt hair, the intense, unblinking stare, all the costumes of the genius were discarded. In their place appeared a woman in soft pastel blazers, clutching the hand of a new partner, holding a newborn baby, playing the role of a naive dreamer who had been misled by those around her. It was the last, desperate performance of a master manipulator trying to hack the judicial system. But the jury did not look at the costume. They looked at the evidence. They saw the forged pharmaceutical logos pasted onto internal documents. They heard the testimony of patients who had been terrified by false cancer diagnoses or false miscarriages. On November 18, 2022, the gavel came down with a heavy, final thud. 11 years in prison. It was a sentence that sent a shockwave through the spine of Silicon Valley. For decades, the mantra of the tech industry was move fast and break things. It was a philosophy that worked for social media apps and food delivery services. But Elizabeth Holmes proved that when you move fast and break things in healthcare, the things you break are human beings. The legacy of Theranos is not a medical breakthrough, but a permanent scar on the psyche of innovation. It stripped naked the blindness of the venture capital world, where fear of missing out, FOMO, proved to be stronger than due diligence. It showed how easily intelligence can be seduced by charisma and a good story. Today, the labs are empty, but the ghost of the machine remains. Somewhere in a garage right now, another founder is pitching an impossible dream to a room full of hungry investors. They are promising to change the world. They are ignoring the laws of physics. And they are hoping, just like she did, that the reality will eventually catch up to the lie before the money runs out. The Edison is dead, but the hunger that created it is very much alive.